Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
It's a pleasure to be back at the Atlantic Council. Let me begin actually by recognizing two people who are not here, but who for me in many ways were the engagement when I was ambassador and earlier, which is Fred Kemp and John Huntsman. And I'm delighted to, I know many of you, but I'm particularly delighted to see Ambassador Dobriansky, because the two of us worked on the kind of issues that I'm going to talk about when we were both in the administration. So, look, when I thought I should come and, avail of your invitation, I felt I should really address what is the core mission of this institution, which was initially, to my understanding, a body which was set up to promote transatlantic understanding, and then has grown beyond that to actually take on the responsibility of engaging the world beyond the transatlantic world as well. So my remarks today are really focused on those sets of issues, which in a sense you could say, how does India relate to the West? How does the West hopefully relate to India? And where do we go on from here? Now, many of you would have heard in another country the term century of humiliation. Okay. India actually had 2 centuries of humiliation with the West, because the West kind of in its predatory form came into India in the mid-18th century and continued almost exactly for 190 years after that. And it was interesting, I think a year ago, there was actually a very serious economic study which tried to estimate how much the British took out of India in value terms. And a very calculated math ended up, put a number of $45 trillion at today's value. So that should give you a sense of really what happened in those 200 years. So while we will speak of all the things we shared today, the reality also is that the history of India and the West is also a history of famine, of slavery, of opium trade. So there is a very dark side to all of this. Now, this is the 150th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. It's almost on October 2nd is actually the birth anniversary. And I think it's worth a while to pause and reflect on how a leader like him actually changed India's attitude towards the West. That in 1947, when India got independence, it need not have had the kind of relationship with the West which it did thereafter. We can debate the merits of it, but I think it's extraordinary in a way that a country which struggled so long for its independence, after that actually kind of reached informal understanding or a compact, in a sense, with the West. And I would sort of regard that as really the ability to set history aside and allow, politics and economics and social connections to take over. So what you don't see in India and have not seen for the last 70 years, even at the most difficult times with the West, has been a kind of mobilization around an anti-Western nationalism. That it has been actually, in many ways, I would say, a cordial relationships. If it was not cordial, it was certainly not frictional. Part of that was also the way we, set up our own institutions and created our own society. And at the end of the day, the fact that we are a liberal democracy, the fact that there is a governance model based on a rule of law, the fact that there is social pluralism, and that we are a market economy, I think these were all really very powerful factors which actually enabled us to put that history behind us. And here I would make one point before shifting to my next argument, which is that India's choices in 1947 and thereafter actually took what were Western values and Western practices and made them near universal. So today, if you have in the developed world or the South, or whatever you call it, really Asia, Africa, parts of Latin America, if you have today a belief that democracy is an ethically superior model of governance, in part it is due to the fact that the first big post-colonial polity actually chose that and then sustained it despite extraordinary odds over the last 70 years. So let's look at the last 70 years, and these last 70 years have really been a very complex history. At one level, I would say the West has actually been very, very supportive of India's growth, India's rise, if you would. You can see that in politics, you can see that in security, in trade, in investment, in services, in education, in particularly in the 50s, 60s, 70s, in development assistance of various kinds. You can see that in the where the Indian diaspora, particularly the more modern voluntary diaspora, is located. I would say, that 40s to perhaps the late 90s, I mean, let's say the 20th century in that sense. This was a period where actually this what I described, a cordial, non-frictional relationship was largely in play, and I think it's had a very invaluable role really in building the India that we have today. But having said that, it is what I would call a sort of a Goldilocks era of our relationship, which is the West didn't want India to get too weak, it didn't want India to get too strong, so it stirred the Indian porridge, or tried to stir the Indian porridge just right, and sometimes, got it, say there were margins of error on either side. So you actually have a very interesting sort of situation where when India in 1962, after the conflict where we were defeated, actually the West comes to the assistance of India. But in less than a decade, in 1971, when it seems to the West that India is seeking a primacy in the subcontinent, the West opposes India. So there's a sort of a bandwidth in which the relationship operates. Now, this bandwidth is not just episodic. I mean, if you look, where is it that we got our relationship right and where is it we did not? Pretty much across the development spectrum, the West was very supportive. But when it came to industrialization, particularly in heavy industries, or when it came to defense and security, the West was very conservative. So you had sort of both geopolitical or political moments as well as sectors where there was this very interesting, I would say, almost a management of relations. And today, if you go to the archives and, a lot of what where the internal thinking of multiple administrations are there for people to access. I think it's most starkly actually laid out by President Eisenhower, but you can see strains of it before him, after him, through multiple administrations. But this idea that how do you keep India in play? A weak India is bad for American Western interests. An excessively strong India is also a problem of a kind. By the way, those days mostly they worried about a weak India. This in a sense was the sort of scenario through the 20th century. Now, somewhere along the way, that began to change, and I'll talk about it. But even though it's changed, I do believe some of the structural issues where there are divergences between India and the West do continue. It's visible on trade, it's visible on IPR issues. It can be visible sometimes on issues of non-proliferation, freedom, civil rights. Which cause do you support, which cause do you not? Sometimes we look at situations where we say, why is the West broadly and the US looking away from what is a visible violation of rights? There'd be times when in some form the same question would be asked of us. And the bottom line for me really is, for all that we have in common, we also need to recognize that we are coming from a different place and we do have different histories. So a lot of the challenge today for us is to reconcile that. So having stated that, what is our current conundrum? From the Indian side, I think there's a clear sense that the power of the West remains very strong. That if you look at the world, the institutions, the regimes, the rules, the practices, the narratives of the world are still largely shaped by the West. The West underwrites international system in many ways. It really governs the global commons also in many ways. But having said that, what has been visible, particularly in the last 10 years, and in the case of China, perhaps even before that, there is a rebalancing underway. The rebalancing was accelerated by the 2008 global financial crisis. And what was initially seen as an economic rebalancing is actually today become a much larger, I would say, strategic, cultural rebalancing as well. And if there is a sort of a single way by which you could capture that, it's the fact today that the G20 has really replaced the G7 as the primary body for global deliberations. Now, while I say that the West still retains great dominance over the international system, it's also a fact that we see a much more divided West, and part of the reason is that the United States is the glue that holds the West together. And I use West in the largest, most expansive sense of the term. I mean, I would call Japan in that sense as part of the West, or perhaps Korea. So I use the, not really a geographical or a ethnic definition, but I capture the alliance constructs or the OECD part of it as well. And so today, as the world is getting more multipolar, the West is also getting more multipolar. And that's a very interesting dynamic when you look at the West. Now, I see two propositions. One, that the West needs India. It needs India because India is an additional engine of growth, that the market access is important, that India's human resources will become more relevant to the world, that we will move to a multipolar world, have in a sense moved to it, and therefore it's important to manage the multipolarity by having good relations with multiple worlds. The fact that in many areas there would be burden sharing of some kind, you can already see that, for example, in HADR operations in our part of the world. And then on global issues, it's important to work with a country like India, and I think nothing illustrates that more than climate change and what happened at Paris. But having said that, I would make the converse argument, which is India needs the West. And India needs the West for a variety of reasons, but I would give you the simplest historical argument for it, which is that every major growth story in the last 150 years has actually paradoxically happened with the support of the West. So whether it is the rise of Japan, whether even the rise of Soviet Union, the rise of Korea, of the ASEAN, of China, all these would not have been possible had they not been done in tandem with the Western interests and Western thinking of that period. The direction of the global economy would also make a stronger argument for this bonding, because as we move into a world of a more knowledge economy world, one of greater technology interdependence, clearly an important factor would be the flow of talent in the world, and there I would suggest that actually India has a somewhat unique position vis-a-vis the economies of the West. So the question which flows from all of this is it possible, is it likely that there's actually a new compact between India and the West? Because if this rebalancing has to be reflected in a different equilibrium, in different equations, in new methods of working each other. Is there actually a sense of how to work that out? So that brings me then to the next question. What does it take us to get to that new compact? And obviously the first point there is to have the realization that there's a need for a new compact. I think that realization is today strong in the United States. I see that to a certain extent in Japan. I see that less in Europe, but moving in the right direction. So it is even the awareness aspect of it clearly needs more work, and for this to develop further. Now, when I say what does it take, I would say that awareness, first of all, needs to translate itself into a recognition of the need for a new balance, which means you really have different kinds of collaborations, different conversations. And in all of this, obviously, India would hedge enough to make sure that it will always have a strong bargaining hand vis-a-vis the West. So the fact that India has other equities and other activities does not detract from what will be, at the end of the day, sort of a central aspect of its foreign policy direction. There are other aspects of what it takes, and one of them is also an understanding of a changed India. A changed India that democratization over the last 70 years in India has had its own impact. That if you look today at India, the politics of India, the social aspects of India, bluntly put, the old elite is now out of business. And really, you have a new set of people with their, different thoughts, with their own, sense of roots, who relate to the world obviously differently from the people who dominated the Indian political scene before them. A third aspect of it, certainly from the Indian point of view, would be one part of it is how do you build bridges, and there the role of the diaspora would be very important. But increasingly, what we can see is that the treatment of the diaspora abroad becomes a factor in India's responses to a particular country or society. So I see that really not just as a conversation between India and its diaspora, but also a factor in our relations with other countries and other partners. Now, and in a sense, that's a two-way factor, because the diaspora also relates to, particularly the Indian diaspora relates much more to development in home country than many other diasporas do. That's something we can discuss if there's interest. From the Indian point of view, as I said, we've in the past noted the fact that the current world order is very much built on institutions and practices which were advanced, which were created, envisaged, and socialized by the West. But we also, frankly, looking ahead, our sense is really the theories of the decline of the West are grossly overstated. That if you look at technology, if you look at even defense budgets, if you look at the will to exercise power, in all of this, if you look at new instruments of pressure which have appeared on the international scene in the last 10 years, in all of this, actually, the West very much maintains its leads. So the task before us, if we are to move in this direction, is one, of course, to strengthen our convergences. And there are issues today, very obvious issues to work together, issues like counterterrorism, issues like maritime security, issues like connectivity. But there will also be divergences, and I think part of the challenge would be to manage those. A lot of those would arise in third country situations like Russia or Iran. And some of it would also be to overcome history. That one of the I would say, the burdens that India carries, the fact that it was not a central part of the 1945 order. It wasn't on the high table at that point of time. So how do you make the world more contemporary? How do you make the world order more contemporaneous? And here I would argue that it is very much in the interest of the West to do that. But it's obviously, again, not a task that is easy. The symbol of that is the UN Security Council, but that's not the only facet of that particular argument. So I would end with a concluding observation, which is that as India itself rises, we are today the 5th or 6th largest economy. We certainly would be the 3rd largest economy, even in nominal terms, by 2030. We will be the most populous country in less than the next 5 years. So the question which we ask ourselves, and I guess in a way the world asks itself, is really what kind of power India would be. And I think a large part of that answer is obviously with that. But I think one part of that answer is also with the West, and what kind of relationship we now forge together, to my mind, would really give us the full picture. So why don't I stop my remarks there, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Dr. Jaishankar, for essentially giving us the Jaishankar doctrine, and what I thought was anyway going to be a fascinating conversation has sort of been elevated by your willingness to engage in a preview, really, of a strategic vision of how India engages with the West in the 21st century under your leadership and the leadership of your government. Thank you, Ambassador Shringla and your team from the embassy, all of you honored guests. We're very grateful that you would take time this morning to join us. So I'm going to ask the Minister a couple of questions to get this conversation going, and then, of course, open it up. You can indicate using your name tent if you want to ask a question. I'm happy to call on you. And again, just a reminder that this is on the record. So, Dr. Jaishankar, let's start with, in a sense, a softball, if you would, right? We'll start the bouncers in a minute. But so starting with the Prime Minister's appearance with President Trump in Houston, then a very full week, as Damon alluded to, of bilateral and multilateral meetings in New York, and then last afternoon with Secretary Pompeo in the evening. You've probably you will leave Washington and leave the United States with a much clearer sense of how the West, as you've described them, is thinking about India at this particular moment in time, what the real challenges are to get the US-India relationship to where you would like it to be. Would you be willing to give us a bit of a readout, as it were, about what you take away from this very long set of meetings over the last week?
First, my meetings aren't over yet. So I still have a few more secretaries to go. So I'm meeting Secretary Esper, I think, tomorrow, and the new NSA, as well as the Homeland Security Acting Secretary. And we're meeting a lot of business in different formats. But look, I mean, to my mind, that I'd kind of put my interest areas in two broad baskets. Okay, one would be really the politics of the West, particularly the internal politics of the West, because I mean, it's, to say that the Western societies are today having an active debate would be the understatement of the year. Every one of them, in some form, has that as an ongoing activity. But really, it's actually a very, I mean, to my mind, really, these few years are going to also probably take us in a very different direction than in the past. That's very obvious. And it's also obvious it's very differentiated. You know, I spend a lot of time in Europe, not just in this job, even in my previous job. And you can see today that if you take the breadth of the political spectrum, both to the left and the right, I mean, on both sides, actually, there's been a kind of expansion, if you will. And I think to a large extent, that's true of American politics as well. And when you have, you know, the two extremes expanding, you obviously have, in each case, much sharper arguments within. But our concern is not to get into those arguments, because we look at the aggregate outcome and where do individual power centers and nations stand, where do they stand collectively. And that really brings me to the second basket. And the second basket is really the economic technology basket, if you would, because I think the rate of change, rate of social change in the world is so extraordinary today, and the importance of technology, it holds a promise actually beyond our imagination, that if you were to think back every 5 years, you couldn't have imagined where you were out there. And what does that then do for our relationship? Because in India, we can't grow the old-fashioned way. We can't go up the manufacturing ladder and then industrialize and then scale it up. So we'll have to kind of do a very unique mix of leapfrogging, of shortcuts, of improvisations. So if you were to ask me, so how is India going to grow? Would it be manufacturing? Would it be services? Would it be startups? Would it be skills? Would it be exports? Would it be globalized, talent-driven? Would it be insular? My answer would be all of the above, because I think we'll kind of end up in that situation. And that kind of India and this much more differentiated, complex West, their coming together to me is really a proposition which is very desirable, but is clearly not just not inevitable, but not easy. It will have its challenges. There will be issues, there will be decisions we would make, which some segments here may not like. It would work the other way around as well. And we'll have to take our lumps as we try to forge different, better relationship. So I leave after this trip even more fascinated by the internal discourse of the places I visit. But I also leave confident from everybody, and I met and all the conversations that I had, that there is if there are some issues on which everybody agrees today, certainly the idea that the Western world, and especially the United States, which, as I said, has been the thought leader in that direction, the fact that our relationship today has a strategic significance, I think I leave very confident of that.